All right. Well, good afternoon. Thank you, Greg, and I want to thank all of the audience, both here live at the Long Beach Convention Center, as well as our future viewers on the video we're producing today. And so I would like to introduce the panel I have the privilege of sharing the stage with today. As Greg said, I'm Joe Elliott from Galveston, Texas. Here from your right, my left, we have Dr. Brenda Wiederhold. She is the co-founder of the Virtual Reality Medical Center, which has designed and developed more than 200 virtual environments for clinical treatment and research. She is the founder of the Interactive Media Institute, a 501c3 nonprofit that holds APA-accredited training courses in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. She is a licensed psychologist both in the United States and in Europe. She is the editor-in-chief of the journal Cyber Psychology, Behavior, and Social Networking. She has been doing, at VRMC, Virtual Reality Medical Center, they've been doing research since the 1990s on various topics that are funded by the U.S., the EU, NATO, and various foundations. She has served as the Senior Behavioral Healthcare Consultant to the U.S. Army Medical Research and Materiel Command, and she is on the medical staff of Scripps Memorial Hospital in La Jolla. And most recent, or very recent activity or research, you are working on virtual reality technique for stress inoculation, which I'll tee up and you can tell us more about here. Next, Dr. Albert Skip Rizzo. Skip is a clinical psychologist and is the director of medical virtual reality at the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies. He's also a research professor with the USC Department of Psychiatry and at the USC Davis School of Gerontology. Skip has been involved in the research and design of VR systems since the 1990s for assessment and treatment of PTSD, traumatic brain injury, autism, ADHD, Alzheimer's, and stroke. His recent work includes the creation of intelligent virtual humans for training clinicians on interviewing skills. And then finally, Dr. Howard Gurr is a clinical psychologist on Long Island, New York. He has been using VR to help patients since 2016, but predating that, he has been producing podcasts for about psychology-related issues since 2006. How he has consulted on with many virtual reality companies around the world, and is currently the ambassador for Amelia XR Health. Also, how he has created an online international directory of therapists who provide MHVR, mental health virtual reality. So please let us welcome our panel. Thank you. All right, so our purpose today, here we go. Our purpose today is not to do, take a look at that. Any of the confusion with the slides is all mine. So all righty, there. All right, our purpose today is to talk about the professional development of a competent, ethical MHVR clinician, mental health virtual reality clinician. A couple of provisos for today's talk. First of all, since this is not a series of individual presentations, but a dialogue, once I finally stop talking, we don't have a lot of specific slides until the end when we offer some resources for professional development. So you may just want to stay ready to snap photos. I have tried to put QR codes with all of the resources that we list. Also, there'll be a couple of slides that we just will not use in the interest of time. So enough. Let us get started. Esteemed panel, each of you has created and collaborated, or at least advised on the creation of tools and resources for MHVR clinicians. As you worked on them, whom did you envision as your prototypical end user? And what were some pain points, both expected and unexpected, that end user clinicians reported back to you? All right, and Brenda, I'm thinking of the VRMC and the stress inoculation training, among others. So why don't you start us off with that question?
Okay. What I'll say is what we've done since the 90s when we started creating worlds is to use a patient-centric model. And so we had the patient, the clinician, the hardware and software engineers, as well as our graphic artists and animation people working together as a team. And so the clinician from the get-go and the patient that the worlds were going to be used on had a say in what was happening. In our stress inoculation training worlds that we've done more recently, so moving from a disease model to a prevention and prediction model, we've actually had people, for instance, with combat medics or emergency room physicians, we've had people that were there and they were telling us in different iterations, no, you got that wrong, you got that wrong. And it's very useful to have them giving that input the whole way through the cycle. As far as the end user, a lot of times we did consider it to be the patient, but again, since the clinicians or the physicians were involved, we have those people or the trainees involved in the development. We also have an APA accredited training program through the 501c3, so we can actually offer that, and we do protocols. So we validate protocols in addition to the software and hardware that we're using for different occupations.
Thanks, Brenda. And Skip, I'm thinking of Brave Mind, perhaps virtual standardized patient that you've been working on. Excuse me. Yes.
Yeah.
So,
I would say that for any application, of course, the clinician and the patient are your customers. You've initially designed an idea operating from a theory of what is going to work for that patient to deliver what we hope is an evidence-based approach. So you're operating from that to start, and you're thinking about the patient, but the clinician has to use it, because in the end, anything that we create are tools. They're not the treatment. They're tools to extend the skills of a well-trained clinician. So, those are both groups. And user-centered design is essential. Like when we first started with Brave Mind, we had an idea of trauma-focused worlds that we could create, but it didn't matter much until we actually had a prototype. And I want to call out Gerald Pear, who's in the audience now. He was the guy with the vision that knew how to build this stuff, and we worked together on it. And immediately, as soon as we had something that we could show, then we had veterans try it and give us feedback. We had service members try it, because there's so many things that you just would never imagine that would be relevant or that would stick in their brain. The wrong insignia patch, and in someone, and in a virtual character in the environment. So it was essential. And this goes across all applications. You have to have that user-centered design in order to build anything that's going to be relevant. You're not just going to get lucky with your great idea from the ivory tower, and all of a sudden everybody's going to love it. And you keep learning. Like after we built the first version of it and got it out and was used clinically, then we just kept getting feedback from clinicians about what patients wanted, what they needed. Kept notes. Next time we got another round of funding, added those in. So it's always an iterative cycle. You're always adding and evolving things. It varies. Like one other project, not related to military, built a virtual classroom for testing kids with attention deficit, with attention process impairments. And now the kids are the users. How relevant is that classroom? Are the distractors we put in it things that actually distract kids? And so it's doing anything in VR is necessarily interdisciplinary, and the discipline of being a patient or the discipline of being a software coder or a graphic artist or a psychologist, you have to work together to build these things in a way that makes any sense.
Right. Thank you. And Howie, I tell a lot of folks that with your Shrink is In podcast series that you've been doing for a long time, to me, you are the Kent By of MHVR podcasting. And so I like the point that you both have made, that the end user, there's actually another layer of user that follows. So when we think about end user, it's multidimensional. What are you hearing from the persons that you interview on your podcasts?
Well, I think that on some level, virtual reality, although it's been around for 30 years, still has a handicap. And the handicap is that there's just not enough awareness that behavioral health can be benefited by the use of virtual reality. Even walking around today, I talked to a bunch of vendors, and they asked me what I did when they read my pass. And I explained what I did, and they were shocked. That, oh.
Did you not know?
I had to explain all over again every single time I talked to somebody about how, yes, virtual reality can be used therapeutically, and it's a clinical tool. And so they were all, kind of taken back. And I think that that's kind of one of the downsides of virtual reality. We know it's evidence-based, we know it works, but the awareness in the public is so limited, and the awareness among clinicians is even startling to me, how unaware they are that this is just a therapeutic tool that works. And I think in reference to your earlier question, there's a lot of the platforms that are being developed in the beginning were very inelegant, I should say, in terms of onboarding and in terms of the clinical technique that was used. And they were kind of cumbersome, and I don't think they were user-friendly. They were written by people who were tech people, but clinicians are not tech people. And so it has to be so intuitive that anybody could use it. And I think now we're seeing in the last couple of years a kind of growth and maturity. And we're seeing products that are much more easy for the clinician to use. Onboarding is easier. And I guess the biggest issue that I hear from the people who I talk to is that sometimes they think the in virtual environments are too CGI, too computer generated, and they don't seem to get the patients to be as immersed, and they don't get that sense of presence. But we know clinically that it doesn't have to be ideal. It doesn't have to be detailed down to the, like a gaming environment. Let's say a company could invest $5 or $6 million to create, a game. Clinical companies in this field don't have that kind of funds. And so they have to understand that this is not a game. This is a clinical tool, and we don't need such fidelity so much that we cover everything, and the brain fills in details. So if I give you X amount of information, there's a good chance I'm still going to get that emotional response, because I'm still going to click in, that amygdala that's going to react to whatever that stressor environment is. So it doesn't have to be perfect to do what we need to do, but people have to understand that.
Can I jump in on that? One thing to keep in mind too is that up until the last maybe 5-10 years, most VR that was being used by clinicians came out of university labs. And university labs are great for innovative ideas and building prototypes, but not for building usable products. And so that was always a big challenge. Now, you take, for example, what's going on with the VA right now. The VA is going on, whole hog on using VR and distributing it across, their network. And they are running into a different set of challenges for adoption. You know, they've got 40 different programs and 10 different headsets. And, you know, how do you train people up to be all-purpose and be able to use all these different things that are changing every year and everything? So the VA is taking that challenge on. And I think this is really good news, because the VA will attract the attention of a lot of other healthcare providers when they hear that the VA is, you know, has got like something like 3,500 headsets throughout their system that they're delivering VR on, and they hear about, you know, oh, for pain management, oh, for physical rehab, oh, for PTSD, and on and on and on. Then that addresses the public consciousness element, I think, and I think that's something to be very hopeful for.
Thank you. And I'd like to drill down just a little bit more, and looking towards a little later when I invite you to maybe say some things to the developers and creatives in our audience. But before that, each of you has utilized existing hardware or software or subscription services. In some cases, you yourself had to cobble together some furniture. I remember seeing in the Brave Mind manual the Rumble platform, and I think it was at VRMC. There's a banister for the acrophobia program. What were some stumbling blocks or some limitations? You don't have to call out any particular companies, but just what, for instance, Skip, why don't you start us off? I'm thinking of Brave Mind. Some others originally used some off-the-shelf components.
Yeah, we want to incorporate scent into the simulations, and at that time, 2004, 2005, there really wasn't any kind of a useful low-cost device. So you had to get this big box with a compressor and put these little scent cartridges in and fill up the whole space, stink up the place, because these weren't nice smells, you know, gunpowder, cordite, burning rubber, rotting garbage, body odor, you know, and on. But that did, for some patients, really add value. So we had to do stuff like that. We also used props, you know, mounted a controller on a mock weapon, because right out of the gate, veterans said, you know, I wouldn't be on a foot patrol in an area like this without my weapon. So we had to get a fake, you know, a weighted fake weapon and put the controller on it for navigation. And then as we found out later, some VAs caught it as it was being shipped into the VA, and we couldn't have a weapon, a mock weapon delivered it. So some VAs, they actually sent it back. But, you know, little things like that. But I mean, basically, we're trying to create experiences to support a therapeutic process. And you try to cobble together and integrate all these different pieces, and each piece has a plus and a minus. You want smell, but you don't want to spend $3,000 on a piece of equipment that makes a lot of noise and stinks the place up. So you look for other solutions, but the Bass Shaker platform, you know, as we've moved to different systems along the way, you have to get a different amplifier. You've got to make it so that the sound goes to the patient, but also to the clinician to talk to them. And, you know, it's changing up all the time. So you got to have a serious technical team to keep up with this stuff.
Well, let me take the solo practitioner side on that. Mm-hmm. I don't have a serious team. I have me. And so I have done things like, for example, I'll have someone on an elevator on the outside of a building. The virtual environment is there on an elevator on the outside of the building. Well, I simply get a fan. And so now the fan is blowing on them when they reach the point where they're on the outside of the building. You know, you kind of think outside the box. I have a driving phobia environment, and I found a very inexpensive steering wheel cover that's light. It's like a leather, kind of leatherette, I don't know, but it's firm enough that if you're holding it, it feels like a steering wheel. And so you kind of like cobble together, this Frankenstein system of things that work. And as a clinician, I think even VR, from my perspective, is you have to think outside the box. You have to be creative. And so even, for example, unfortunately, Google 360 used to be out there, and there were enough virtual environments that I could pull them up. And so for example, I live on Long Island. There's an expressway called the LIE, which is probably very comparable to the ones in Los Angeles. It's like a parking lot. And you could sit there forever, and it's filled with trucks and all sorts of things. So the people that have difficulty with driving, 100% of them are going to have difficulty with the LIE. And there are periods on the LIE where the exits are too far away, and so people would actually get off the highway, take the service road for 2 exits, and go back on the highway because they wanted to bypass that area because they couldn't find a fast enough exit. But what happened was people literally had created 360 videos of the LIE from one end to the other. And Google had them housed on the Google 360, and I was able to put people on the LIE at the exits that they had difficulty with by using just an Oculus and downloading a 360 video. But it's gone. It's not there anymore. And so that took out a very simple way of coming up with very creative and simple solutions to creating virtual environments that were individualized to individual patients' needs. But you just have to think outside the box to come up with these things. And many of these kind of, off-the-cuff kind of solutions literally work.
Speaking of driving, I think, Brenda, you told me you used a driving game system or immersive system.
Yeah, we started with just something called Midtown Madness in the 1990s, and it was a replica of Chicago. And I mean, we were in San Diego, but we were able to, with the steering wheel, brake and gas, and turning the lights off and getting them to go on that. It worked well, and I even took a similar thing. It was called city driving to Belgium with me, and so they had European streets, they had U.S. streets, and just getting the patient, kind of priming them and getting all those props in the office, so having a actual auto seat. So we went to a scrapyard and we got a car seat. And so they put on their seatbelt, they have the steering wheel, brake and gas, there's a rumble under them. Same with the airplane seats. So they have that rumbling when they take off and land, they have that seatbelt on them. So being able to think of those things to add, and I would just want to say too, and Skip mentioned this, and so did Howie, it's the proper cues in the world. So it doesn't have to be photorealistic for a lot of these things. It's just putting those cues that the patient needs and listening to them, doing a good intake in clinical history, understanding their specific needs. And you're not going to have an exact virtual world for every patient you see, but because you know their specific case, you can add in those things. Like when we did Iraq and Afghanistan, we had a heat lamp and a fan. So their convoy is going down the streets. They get that heat. They get that wind blowing on them. The same with what Joe talked about with the fan for heights. So putting them on a railing so they were a little elevated from where they were, and having that fan blow on them. But I will say that one of the big barriers we're having now as clinicians is I have about 7 different headsets for seven different manufacturers' software. So we have our own software we've developed, but we also use several other companies' software. So that means every single one uses a different headset, uses a different clinician portal. And so to expect a lot of clinicians, single clinicians, to invest in all of that, whether they don't know for sure if they're going to like VR or not, because it's just a tool, and learning how to integrate that in your traditional therapy is not always easy. So I think as we go towards a universal platform, so having more and more content that works with the same headset, that works with the same clinician portal, I think we will see adoption start to get better.
Hope so. Yeah, I started with a HTC Vive Pro Eye using Google Earth Street View, but it doesn't. It moves one little spurt at a time, and then the next treatment suite I licensed, I needed another headset and all. So talking about the barriers to clinical adoption. How you mentioned thinking outside of the box, and Brenda, you're telling the truth about the need for many different platforms, many different headsets. So, I've read that the barriers to adoption include insufficient training, lack of research base, and the reason I'm stealing all that thunder is I think there's a lot of those that are known, but what would be the answer then? But also if there's some others. Is thinking outside the box one that is keeping folks, clinicians, from adopting? Howie, why don't you start us off with that?
Yeah, I think clinicians are trained in a particular theory or platform or philosophy, and then they go out and they think, okay, I'll get a card printed up and I'll have a telephone number and I have an address and I'm ready to go. But of course, that's not how it works. And I think that they're trained to do clinical work, but they have no understanding about the fact that they're actually in a business and they're there to help people, but they also have to earn an income. And so clinicians, for the most part, are not, if you look at the average, I think, of, clinicians' income, across the country, you're talking about $70,000 or $80,000 a year, which is not a lot of money, and therefore they have very difficult time spending money thinking that they're going to get a return on that. So they're not trained to run a business. They're not making a lot of money. They only understand what they're trained in, and if they're not trained in VR, that's something that's alien to them, and they're not comfortable taking on something that ethically they feel like they can't really follow through or do professionally. So there's not the training that needs to be going on to get clinicians to be able to use VR effectively. I think that there are ethical issues, and I think that there are concerns some people have that VR creates a distance between themselves and the patient. And they see that as a block in terms of the therapeutic relationship. I don't believe that, but that's what some clinicians believe. And I think that they're concerned that they don't know what they're doing. And to be able to think outside the box in an area where you're not comfortable and you can't do that. And I think that they're concerned that they are stepping into territory that they don't understand. And they also think, for some reason, actually it's not for a reason, but they believe on some level that having a company between them and the patient is also a HIPAA-compliant issue. That there's another player in the room, and there's another person or connection that's in between them and the patient, and they're concerned about where's that information go. So there are all these other factors, and there's tons of stuff, but those are the major factors, I think, from my perspective, why they don't step into the territory besides the fact that they don't even know it exists.
Okay, thanks. Brenda, you recently, or not too long ago, authored a paper of the SWOT analysis of deploying VR. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So did that fall into your analysis, the barriers to adoption?
That was partly the barriers to adoption. I think one of the other, a couple things. Complexity is still an issue for private practitioners, and especially as we're starting to send more things home with patients to use between sessions, so having them have the headsets at home. Not all psychologists are able to help them set up those headsets. And so companies that offer those, that don't offer that tech support, it's just another barrier to the psychologist or clinician. And another thing that is a big barrier right now is payment. And that's, again, I'm happy to hear, the VA is going more and more into that. And we do have codes for demonstration right now. So Applied VR got a code for reimbursement. There are other codes we can put down for reimbursement, but they're for demonstration only. They're not for reimbursement. And Anthem came out actually in a 2023 statement on their website, so I didn't make it up. And I don't think it was hacked. But it said there is no evidence that this works clinically. And there is. A Cochrane report says it works in many different areas. But when you have large insurance companies saying things like that, it's very difficult to fight that. So it's a barrier. Another barrier has been, and I've dealt with this in training clinicians. Some clinicians, and these are young clinicians, these are in their 20s and 30s sometimes, they're like, oh, it's going to take away the therapeutic rapport, or each of my patients is an individual, and this is going to homogenize therapy. No, it's not going to. You're still a good clinician, and those clinical skills, that clinical judgment is the most important thing. This is a tool, and unless you know how to use a tool, it's going to be an expensive doorstop. But it's just like an EHR. If you go to a clinician, a physician that sits with the computer in front of him and says, how are you doing today? What's your blood pressure? What are you doing? And never looks at you, well, you're probably not going to go back to that physician. It's the same. If the therapist thinks that's the most important thing in the room is the piece of equipment, it is going to be a barrier between the patient and clinician. So those are a few things I think as those start to go away, the complexity, the reimbursement, I think some things will work. I will say, though, we need to start training people in their programs, whether it's a master's program or a PhD program or a MD program. If they learn to use the tools in those programs, they won't worry about when they're out and have a mortgage and 2 kids and, an office to pay for. They'll go, okay, I learned that in my school. I'm not going to see patients without it.
Thanks. And Skip, for whatever reason, I know what the reason is. I just started working with doing some cognitive rehabilitation with some stroke patients, and so specifically cognitive rehab, but generally therapy. You've been doing it since the 90s. Are you hesitant to adopt VR? Are there any barriers? Or what have your colleagues been saying?
Well, you do hear from people that aren't familiar with the technology, that statement about it puts a barrier between you and your client, which, I just say is bullshit. Quite frankly, if you can create an experience and use this tool to help create experiences that activate emotions, and then use your clinical skills to help people process those emotions or to reconceptualize why those emotions are happening in that context, to give people opportunities, keep them in the flow channel, give them opportunities to be successful early on, but not make it boring by manipulating the stimulus presentation. That breeds a connectedness. With the Brave Mind scenario, a lot of times I was a VA psychologist in the very beginning, and Vietnam era veterans would say, well, you didn't serve, how can you help me with PTSD? And it's like, well, okay, I've worked with schizophrenics, so I don't think I have schizophrenia, but you don't say that. But, well, maybe. You don't say that to them, but that's what you think, and you try to come up with your rationale. But now using VR, where the clinician has to learn this, they have a control panel where they can adjust everything in real time that's going on in whatever virtual world for trauma, 14 different worlds, the time of day, the number of people, the sound effects. They got this Wizard of Oz control panel. And what happens is the patient isn't passive. They're not just sitting there watching stuff happen. They're encouraged to narrate their story, to talk about the trauma as if it's happening right then and there. And Clinician is just mimicking parts, the bomb went off over here to the right, click, bing, jet flew over, fly over. And in the end, there's been a number of patients that have said, I feel like you understand me better because they don't say this, but we co-constructed my experience. They use other words for it, but the idea that we built this together, in my experience, they feel like you have a tighter connection, better understanding of what they went through in their trauma experience. And I think that's common across anything, whether it's phobias or in the cognitive rehab area where you can control the rate of presentation or change up the context in which the task is delivered in and sit with them and go through, review it, talk to them about it. You have boundless opportunities to maintain that therapeutic alliance. You're just using a tool. That's cool.
Thanks. Now I would like to talk a bit about guidelines and standards for practice, and going to flip ahead to a slide. It's not that one. It's that one. Same slide. And I do have I would like to ask you all what exists now, what still needs to be done. But first, I wanted to invite Skip and Brenda. You contributed to the article, or the research, and created this model. Would you please present it, what this is?
Well, basically, it's been a while now. I got to review it
Okay,
myself.
thinking in terms of standard. Okay.
Well, I mean, we're just trying, basically, and that's part of the call out for this particular journal MXR, is one of the emphases of the journal is to focus not just on publishing findings of direct clinical tests, of course that's important, but trying to shape the field and present guidelines that we can kind of all get behind and have a little bit more of a structure so we have a common knowledge about how VR can be used for what populations, what are the primary elements, how to report the data. I mean, IEEE does this all the time with standards, and so we felt that the field needed these kinds of things. And working on one right now for standards for AI chatbots. And that goes the spectrum of everything from, how broad the domain of a character should be, the transparency, to the ethical issues, and where you can get away with the open-ended AI kind of a thing versus, don't even think about it, script the interaction. And so these are all things that I think we all know from our work, but they need to kind of be formalized and shared, with people that have an interest in this area. So that's really where this paper came out of. Just a whole bunch of people got together and threw down some ideas and organized it.
Yeah, and we were also, I think, Skip, you were on both papers too. Our colleagues in Sweden and our colleagues in the Netherlands also started developing. It's called RATE-XR, is the one from the Netherlands, and then for Sweden was the SWOT analysis. But getting people together from, Asia, Europe, US, all across the world, and developing different standards for doing research studies. So what do we need to be looking at in research studies, as well as what do we need to look at in practice? The difficulty will be, though, is governments have to say something about this too. So we're going to be able to do this as clinicians or academicians, but until somebody adopts it and says you have to follow these guidelines, it'll fall a little short, but it's a first step.
Right, so within the larger body of MXR, medical extended reality, then the MHVR, which, by the way, we're not trying to insinuate there should be a creation of a new animal that is just a mental health VR guy, person, but rather, as Brenda, actually, a couple of you said, it's just a tool. And we may not use, you may not use it for many of our clients. Who would be the body to regulate such guidelines and standards?
Well, I will say one thing, and I gave this at Cedars-Sinai as part of my talk. One of the frightening things right now is, as clinical psychologists, we have certain rules. We can't practice across state lines, for instance, or in other countries, but coaches can. And so a lot of people with master's degrees are saying, no, I'm a coach now. I'm not really a therapist. But if we were to do that, we would get in major trouble for that. Now, these licensing rules were formed in the 1870s, so they're antiquated. But we need to look at those sorts of things. So that's one of the difficulties I see right now.
I think you got to regulate yourself with guild-like organizations that take an interest and do the heavy lifting to put it out there before the government comes in and starts regulating you. And psychologists, no offense to other professions, but we probably have the most evolved ethical standards of any of these professions in terms of how it's specifically laid out for, the goal of protection of the patient. I mean, there's just so many different steps. So that serves as a good basic model, but I'm not even sure if APA, American Psychological Association, should be jumping into regulating this. I don't trust them really either. I think some of the organizations that have sprung up around clinical VR that are people that know VR, that understand where it's good and where it's not so good and how to apply it and what certification you need. Or, you don't want somebody just to buy a software program and call themselves an exposure therapist if they've never done it in a traditional format. I mean, there's a whole thing about working with trauma or working with kids or working with people that have suffered from injuries, physical injuries. So those unique groups, I think, are going to be the best informed to kind of set these guidelines and standards.
Wasn't AMXRA trying to, that's one of their goals, to set up some kind of credentialing program for the use of extended reality? So that's a new organization. It's been around, maybe a little over a year now? And I think that they're trying to kind of stabilize and concretize this so that there is a system to set up credentialing for people who use extended reality. But it's just an infant organization at this point.
Thanks for bringing that up, Howie. It's almost like there was a list of prompts that was handed out on the panel, and you went to it, and I appreciate that. It was wanting to ask, what are the panel's views on credentialing, formal, or how formal? And if so, who would do that? And if not, then why? Howie's already started us off.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, AMXARA may be a credentialing agency, but I think, and we mentioned this earlier, I think virtual reality therapy, which is a tool, it's not a new treatment, it's an extension of exposure therapy, needs to be taught on a graduate level, whatever program a person attends, for them to step into that territory. They need to be prepared and understand what they're doing. And there are very few programs that do that. I know, I mentioned, I guess I was talking to you earlier, that Hofstra University does have a program where they train their graduate students in the use of virtual reality. But I don't know how many programs there are out there that do that. So we have a group of people who are credentialed and trained, And then we could know after a while what we need to have as credentialing for that particular population of therapists. But I personally look at virtual reality as an outgrowth of exposure therapy. It's exposure therapy on steroids, really. And I think that it requires someone to know how to do exposure therapy, which many therapists are averse to try because they think it's, I don't know, too tough or too challenging or threatening to the patient. But if it's done correctly, it's not. But anyway, so there's a cognitive behavior therapy approach, and then to me it's a combination of that and mindfulness and relaxation therapy and education. Educating the patient to what's going on so they know what's happening and why it's happening and what they can control and what they can't control. But those are the components that I think someone really has to understand to, I think, use virtual reality therapy properly.
Brenda, you started shaking your head.
No, I do not. I am not currently supporting more certifications and schooling that is mandated, because we saw that with ABPP. A lot of times people got their American Board of Professional Psychology certification afterwards. Very difficult to do. Again, not everybody has the time or wants to do that. And it's the same thing, but I think as a psychologist, I mean, in our code of conduct, it says practice within your boundaries. I mean, I have never seen schizophrenics in my private practice. It's not something I feel that I can see and do a good job with. I refer out. So you got to kind of police yourself in that way. It's like, you know, always have the patients good at the end of the day, that being what you are led with, not, oh, I need some more money to pay the rent. But practice within your standards. And two things, it was very interesting. Very early on, we called an insurance company and we wanted, and this is back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we're like, well, we're using virtual reality and biofeedback and we don't know what insurance code to use. And they said, tell us what you're doing. And so we said, okay, well, we're putting the patient in a headset and we're monitoring their physiology and we're taking them on a flight. And it was, we were flying at the time. They said, all you're doing is exposure therapy. And we said, yeah. And they're like, well, it's individual psychotherapy. You're just using extra stuff. You're not going to get paid extra right now, but you can code it as individual psychotherapy. So I think it is, Howie, it's just exposure. Right. But it's better. But we do have some people, and I will say this, there are some people that say, well, it's not going to work because they're doing it in virtual reality and you want them to do it in real life. Of course, duh. I mean, you translate the skill sets, you teach them the skill sets, you empower them, you give them that self-efficacy and that self-confidence, and when they go into the real-world setting, they're more likely to do that and push the envelope there too, because they've already done it, 10 times in the virtual world. So we're not replacing one thing with another, but people need to know that, and then again, just practice within your boundaries.
I just close on this with the idea of credentialing, that there's legally binding credentialing thing that the state enforces with their review boards and so on. But there's also, again, credentialing that isn't legally binding, but it might be a selling point to a patient that this person has gone through the AMXR or whatever program, is certified in this area, and that might be the happy medium. Because if you start really stepping out of line, you're going to violate one of the legal things. If you start talking about your patients, naming them, or violating confidentiality, these kind of things, or practicing out of your sphere of expertise, you're going to get nailed on the standard stuff. And so the VR stuff is really more about different elements of it really follows all the same things, just has to be worded a little differently as far as the guidelines. But getting that little bit of extra credential, that might make a difference for a marketing element.
It's a comfort element for the clinician, I think. If I have some training, at least I could say, all right, I know what I'm doing. And since they've never gotten training before, and then they go to some program, which could be some outside agency that is producing a good program, at least they'll have some comfort in terms of their skill set.
Yeah, and I will say, and thanks for reminding me, Skip, we actually did deploy some of our systems into larger organizations, and those organizations said, you can't see, to their therapists, you cannot see patients with this until you go through a training program. And so I think that was very, very good of them to say that. And hopefully that is what a lot of organizations will do as they start to implement this.
Okay. We have just a couple of minutes remaining, and so if you want to get your cameras ready, I'm going to show some slides of professional development resources that most of the panel members here have contributed to, as well as some of the other references. AMXRA and some others are here. So let me move to that. Okay, for those clinicians out there wanting to get going, notice these books. These are some seminal primers you'll want to get. The one on the left is updated book by Brenda and Stéphane Bouchard. And then the one in the middle there is pretty new, just came out. And the one thing that you can't tell is the relative size. The one on the left, Brenda's book's about 200. That big boy in the middle is 460 pages or something. It's a good one. I'm trying to get that for my Father's Day gift. All right, some training opportunities. There is the IMI. And also, there in the middle, PESI has some courses. Elizabeth McMahon has a course on PESI there. And also, Stanford, that's Kim Bullock's group there at Stanford. And then VR for Health. And then right as we were preparing this presentation, this popped up on my feed. And they are pleased to present the Immersive Tech Talk podcast series hosted by Dr. Skip Rizzo. All right, looking forward to that. And yes, we've got the QR code there for that, though it's actually just to the VRD Health Tech site. They didn't have one up yet. Might want to talk to your guys there. For some networking, Virtual Reality Therapists International in the upper left-hand corner there, that is Howie's group. You've got how many folks? Now we're down to 68. Down to 68. Okay, it fluctuates. Upper right-hand corner there is the iActor. Brenda's part of that. That is from what? What is iActor?
International Association of Cyberpsychology Training and Rehabilitation, and that's a group we started under a nonprofit in Europe, so IMI Europe.
Okay, thank you. And let's see, IVRA is here down in the Expo Center if you want to go meet Bob Fine. I saw him earlier, and then Mark Zhang's AMXRA and others et al. And then bottom left-hand corner, Spitzy, another program or networking group at Stanford, Kim Bullock's group. And the bottom right-hand, Society for Virtual Reality Therapy, it is still up. Elizabeth McMahon's husband started that. Some journals that are available. The time? Okay, and it is time. So take a picture of that and take a picture of those conferences. The one on top is Brenda's. And then there we are. And sorry I ran us out of time. If you'd like to ask us some questions, we'll be down there.